A light rain tapped against the windows of Ridgeview Café, casting long reflections on the linoleum floor as the clouds outside rolled in like old regrets. Inside, the silver napkin dispensers gleamed under tired fluorescent lights, and the booths bore the quiet weight of stories no one had told in years. Near the window, where the sun always struck too harshly in the mornings, an older woman sat alone. She wore a black wool coat that looked older than the cafe itself, and a small navy crest pinned just above her heart. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and she came in every morning at 7:04 a.m. sharp, not to be seen, but not to disappear either. She never ordered much. Just dry toast and tea. Never complained. Never asked for more. And every morning, as the world buzzed by without noticing her, one person did: Emma Clark. Emma was 24, barely scraping by on tips, and still learning how to carry a smile even when her feet throbbed and rent loomed like storm clouds. But she had a quiet strength in her, the kind you don't learn, only earn. Maybe that's why she noticed Eleanor in the first place. Maybe it's why, when others looked past her, Emma leaned in. It started with small gestures, warming Eleanor's tea before she asked, swapping out cold toast for fresh, slipping a packet of jam onto the plate without a word. Little things. Forgettable to most. But not to Eleanor. And not to Emma, who knew all too well how much quiet kindness could mean in a world that forgets people once they grow old, or tired, or poor. Before we go deeper, if you've ever wondered what one moment of compassion can do for a soul on the edge, this story is for you. If you believe kindness matters not in grand speeches, but in silent actions, stick with us. Because Emma had no idea who Eleanor really was. Or that her smallest act would lead to a moment no one in the cafe would ever forget. The first time Emma saw Eleanor cry was on a Monday. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The first time Emma saw Eleanor cry was on a Monday. Not a loud, broken kind of cry, just the quiet welling of tears that don't spill so much as shimmer. Eleanor had her napkin lifted, dabbing discreetly beneath one eye, but Emma had already seen the sadness there. She didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, she refilled Eleanor's tea with a gentleness that said everything without needing to speak. Over the next few weeks, their silent ritual became something more. Eleanor still arrived precisely at 7:04 a.m., always dressed neatly, always with that silver naval crest pinned just above her lapel. She never made a fuss, never asked for more than toast and tea. But Emma began to notice other patterns too, the way Eleanor paused before handing over her coins, fingers trembling slightly, eyes darting to the register like she was bracing for judgment. Every time, Emma smiled like the world was perfectly in order. When she realized Eleanor was rationing her change, stacking dimes carefully, double-checking her total, Emma made a quiet decision. She keyed in discounts when she could, sometimes punching in a customer loyalty coupon that didn't exist. Her manager, Gus, barely looked up when she explained. "Old regular?" he asked, and Emma nodded. "Then make sure she keeps coming," he said, half joking, not knowing how much Emma needed Eleanor to come back to. A few of the other servers started to notice. "Gus knows you're doing this, right?" Gina asked one afternoon, arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. "It's just tea and toast," Emma said. "It's not about the food," Gina replied. "You're getting attached." Emma didn't answer because part of her already had quietly, completely. Even the cook, Ray, chimed in once. "She tip you in war medals or something," he joked as he slid a plate down the pass. Emma gave a half smile. "Something like that," she murmured. She never told them how Eleanor's quiet presence was the one fixed point in her own unpredictable life. Or that for the first time, she looked forward to mornings. They started talking a little more each day. It began with the weather, moved to books. Eleanor liked historical novels, particularly ones about the sea. Emma had never read any, but she started flipping through a few at the library just so she could ask questions. "I suppose I always felt close to the ocean," Eleanor once said, staring out the window. "It's the only place that doesn't feel like it's moving too fast." Emma noticed the way Eleanor held her mug, both hands wrapped around it like it might float away. She noticed, too, how Eleanor always waited a beat before leaving, as if giving the day one last chance to surprise her. One morning, Emma walked her to the door after her shift. "You always walk home?" Eleanor asked. Emma nodded, brushing her damp ponytail over one shoulder. "Buses don't show up on time," she said with a shrug. "Or sometimes not at all." There was a long pause before Eleanor responded. "If you ever want a ride, dear, you only have to ask." Emma smiled politely. "That's kind of you," she said, "but I like the walk." Eleanor nodded but didn't press further. Still, something in her expression lingered, as if she wasn't just offering help, but watching to see how Emma received it. The next day, Emma came in early and noticed something tucked under the napkin holder. It was a paperback, The Light Between Oceans, worn at the spine but neatly wrapped with a ribbon. No note. But Emma didn't need one. She looked over at the booth where Eleanor sat sipping tea and simply smiled. Eleanor smiled back, that same faint glimmer of satisfaction softening her stern features. Later that week, Eleanor came in with gloves on despite the unseasonably warm weather. Emma noticed, but didn't say anything, not until Eleanor accidentally dropped a coin and bent too slowly to pick it up. Emma moved first, scooping it up. Their eyes met for a moment. Not pity, just understanding. "My joints," Eleanor said softly, "have started writing stories without my permission." Emma laughed gently, not at her, but with her, as if sharing the punchline of something only they knew. More and more, Eleanor began to open up, never too much, always in fragments. She mentioned her late husband once, only in passing. "He liked his toast burned," she said one morning, staring down at the perfectly golden slices Emma had brought. Said it reminded him of the Navy kitchens. Emma tilted her head. "Was he military?" Eleanor simply nodded. "Rear Admiral," she said, like it meant nothing, like it was someone else's memory. Emma blinked. It was the first time Eleanor had said anything that sounded like it belonged to another life, a grander one, maybe, or at least one that came with medals and secrets. "That's impressive," Emma said softly. Eleanor shrugged. "Ranks don't hold you at night," she said. "They don't sit with you when grief makes the room too loud." Emma swallowed, unsure how to respond. That night, as she walked home, Emma thought about that sentence for a long time. She'd known loss too, not through war, but through abandonment, silence, and the kind of love that forgets to stay. Maybe that's why she kept showing up for Eleanor. Because underneath it all, Emma wasn't saving her. They were saving each other, one cup of tea at a time. Then came the brooch conversation. It was a slow Tuesday. Eleanor was wearing her usual coat, the brooch glinting under the cafe's dim lights. Emma couldn't help but ask, "That pin, is it a military thing?" Eleanor touched it gently, her fingers pausing over the silver crust. "It was my husband's," she said. "And then my son's. The Navy gave them both back to me." She looked out the window. "I wear it because it reminds me not to forget." Emma sat across from her briefly, the shift quiet for once. "I've never known anyone in the Navy," she said honestly. "They're people just like anyone else," Eleanor replied. Then, with a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, she added, "I've seen the best of people in uniform, and the worst of people without one." Emma didn't ask what she meant. But the way Eleanor said it left something cold in the air, something heavier than rain. The next morning, Eleanor wasn't there at 7:04. Emma checked the clock twice, poured the tea anyway. 7:10, 7:20. Nothing. But just as the worry began to set in, the door opened and Eleanor appeared, a little more breathless than usual, clutching her coat tightly around her. "You're late," Emma teased gently, but her eyes searched Eleanor's face. "I got caught talking to an old friend on the phone," Eleanor said, settling into the booth with more effort than usual. "It's been a while since anyone called to ask how I was." Emma placed the tea down, then sat quietly across from her, no words needed. They sipped their drinks in peace. Outside, the rain had turned to snow. The wind had changed that week, sharper, colder, curling under doors like a quiet warning of winter. Emma noticed Eleanor shivering a little more as she sat down in her usual booth, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The cafe heater rattled in protest, doing its best, but warmth didn't quite reach that corner window. That morning, before her shift, Emma had stopped by a secondhand shop on 5th Street. With the last of her tip money, she bought a hand-knit scarf in soft gray wool, the kind of gray that matched Eleanor's eyes. She didn't say anything dramatic when she gave it to her. Just walked over with Eleanor's tea and gently laid the scarf on the table beside the plate. "For you," Emma said with a small shrug. It looked warm. Eleanor stared at it like it was an antique vase, fragile and far too precious to touch. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, and for a moment, she just held it there, pressed to her chest like a secret. "Did you make this?" Eleanor asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma shook her head. "I wish. But I picked it because it reminded me of something quiet and good." Eleanor slowly wrapped it around her neck, eyes glassy but not yet spilling. "It's been a long time since anyone thought of me like that," she said, and Emma didn't know what to say, only that her throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected. That scarf, in that moment, became something far heavier than wool. The next day, Eleanor brought in a photograph. It was small, black and white, curled slightly at the edges. In it, a younger Eleanor knelt in a wide garden bed, surrounded by flowers, a sunnet tilted just so on her head. "That was my garden by the sea," she said softly. "Before I moved inland. Before everything changed." Emma leaned closer, tracing the petals with her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. "You must have loved it." Eleanor nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the photo as if remembering the soil under her nails. "I used to grow lavender and mint," she said. "The kind of scents that made you feel like life still had time for softness." Emma found herself talking more, too. The gaps in their conversation started to fill, not with obligation, but with shared memory. She told Eleanor about her time in group homes, the good ones and the bad, the ones that made her feel invisible and the rare ones that didn't. "I learned early that nothing lasts," she said one day. "So I try to hold on to the little things, like warm tea and people who sit in the same booth every day." Eleanor looked at her then with something almost maternal. There was no pity in her eyes, only knowing. "If I had a daughter," she said, "I'd want her to have your heart." Emma blinked hard, suddenly unsure what to do with the emotion in her chest. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me," she admitted. "Then it's long overdue," Eleanor replied. The scarf stayed with Eleanor every day after that. Sometimes she arrived already wearing it, tucked neatly beneath her coat. Other times it was folded on the booth beside her cup, like a symbol, a placeholder. Emma never pointed it out again, but she noticed. She noticed everything. Later that week, Emma found a flyer on the community board outside the cafe. It was for the city library's senior outreach program, free library cards, home deliveries, reading groups. She clipped it down and slid it into her apron, unsure whether to mention it. But the next morning, when Eleanor said she missed the feel of a real book, Emma pulled it out and laid it on the table beside her toast. "Thought you might be interested," she said, casual, careful not to push. Eleanor took it with both hands, holding it like a fragile document. "I haven't filled out paperwork in years," she said, almost embarrassed. Emma offered to help, and they sat together after the lunch rush, leaning over the form like conspirators. Eleanor's handwriting was shaky, but legible: name, birth date, address. "That's the first thing I've signed that wasn't a bill," she said. "It feels different." The next afternoon, a small envelope arrived at the cafe addressed to Miss Eleanor Hayes. Inside was her brand new library card, embossed and official. Emma handed it to her like a gift. Eleanor clutched it to her chest and whispered, "I didn't think I'd matter on paper anymore." Emma smiled. "You matter more than most people I know." That night, after closing, Emma was wiping down tables when she noticed something at the register. A folded piece of paper, slipped under the tip jar, marked only with her name. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the neat, old-fashioned cursive. "Thank you for remembering I exist." Emma stood there for a long time, holding the note like it might disappear if she blinked. She read it again. And again. Then tucked it into the notebook she kept behind the counter, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded her that small things still mattered. More than anyone else that day, Eleanor had made her feel like she had a purpose. Like she was helping something bloom again. The next morning, Emma brewed the tea a little earlier. She cleaned Eleanor's booth twice and made sure the toast was perfectly crisp on one edge, soft on the other, just how she liked it. Eleanor walked in with the scarf wrapped tight and a hint of color in her cheeks. She slid into the booth, looked up, and smiled. Not a tired smile. Not a guarded one. A real one. Emma knew she might never learn everything about Eleanor's past. But that was okay, because what they were building wasn't about old chapters. It was about the ones they were still quietly writing, toast by toast, morning by morning. And sometimes, that was more than enough. Have you ever had someone show you kindness when you didn't expect it or needed it most? What did it change for you? If this moment warmed your heart, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us how much the little things truly matter. The first thing Emma noticed that morning was that the tea had gone cold. She had poured it at 7:03, just like always, and placed it gently at Eleanor's booth. But now it sat untouched, steam long vanished, as the clock on the wall ticked past 7:30. The regulars came and went, the scent of buttered toast filled the air, but the corner booth stayed empty. Emma tried not to worry, tried to tell herself maybe Eleanor had a doctor's appointment, or maybe the bus ran late, but her stomach told her otherwise. When the bell above the door finally jingled, Emma turned fast enough to nearly spill coffee. Eleanor stepped in slowly, more hunched than usual, her coat drawn tight as though holding herself together. Her face was pale, and the shadows beneath her eyes seemed deeper, older, like they had been there for years, but only just revealed themselves. Most startling of all, her brooch was missing. That small silver navel crest, always pinned to her coat with quiet pride, was nowhere to be seen. Emma brought over the tea again, fresh this time, and gently placed it in front of her. "I missed you this morning," she said softly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She simply stared down at the cup, her hands trembling as she wrapped her fingers around it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Emma knelt beside the booth, one hand resting lightly on the table. "Is everything okay?" she asked, careful not to rush the question. Eleanor blinked quickly, wiping at the corner of her eye with a tissue she hadn't realized she was holding. "No," she said. "Everything's ending." Emma waited, heart thudding softly behind her ribs. Eleanor exhaled, long and slow, like she'd been holding her breath for days. "My lease isn't being renewed," she said, her voice steadier now, but hollow. "The building's being renovated. New owners. They want to upscale it, no room for someone like me." Emma felt her jaw tighten. "Can't they help you relocate? Find another place nearby?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I've tried," she said. "But fixed income and long waiting lists don't care that you've lived somewhere for 17 years. She let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out even time forgets loyalty." Emma didn't know what to say. Her throat ached, her hands clenched in her apron. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she looked up, her eyes shining. "I think I might just disappear. Quietly. No fuss." That sentence hit Emma like a crack down the middle of a plate, sudden, silent, and permanent. Her breath caught. "Don't say that," she said, too quickly. "You can't just vanish." But Eleanor gave her a small, tired smile, not defeat, but resignation. Emma stood up, chest tightening. "No," she said. "You're coming home with me tonight." Eleanor blinked as if she hadn't heard her correctly. "Emma, that's not it is," Emma cut in. "I've got a couch. A heater that works when it feels like it. And more than enough tea." Eleanor tried to protest again, but Emma had already walked to the register and grabbed her coat. "I'll walk with you," she said. "We'll go get your things." Eleanor hesitated, then slowly stood, her fingers still trembling. "You don't know what you're offering," she said. Emma looked at her then, really looked, and replied, "I know exactly what I'm offering. A place to breathe." They walked to Eleanor's apartment together, the sky drizzling softly above them. The building was old, brick crumbling in places, windows clouded with age. Inside, Eleanor's unit was spotless but sparse, a worn recliner, a small bookshelf, and a bed with neatly folded linens. No photos on the walls. No clutter. Just the kind of simplicity that spoke of someone who had learned to live without taking up too much space. Eleanor packed slowly, her hands lingering on small things. A photo of her husband in uniform. A dog-eared novel with notes in the margins. The brooch, now resting in a small jewelry box instead of pinned to her coat. "I didn't wear it today," she said softly. "Didn't feel like I'd earned it." Emma said nothing, just helped fold a sweater and tucked it gently into the bag. Back at Emma's apartment, things were a little cozier. A small kitchen with mismatched mugs. A living room that doubled as a sleeping space, with a sagging couch covered in a bright blue blanket. Emma had cleared her room for Eleanor, fresh sheets pulled tight, a small lamp on. "It's not fancy," she said, trying not to sound self-conscious. "But it's yours." Eleanor looked around, taking it all in slowly. Her fingers brushed the books stacked on the nightstand, the candle by the window. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice small. "I didn't," Emma replied. "But I wanted to." There was a pause, and then Eleanor said something Emma would remember for the rest of her life. "No one's wanted me in a very long time." That night, Emma made soup, canned but warm. They ate in silence, soft music humming in the background from the old radio Emma always left on. Afterward, Emma set up the couch with blankets and a pillow. But Eleanor stood in the hallway, holding onto the doorframe. "Take the bed," Emma said firmly. "I insist." Eleanor didn't argue this time. She walked into the bedroom slowly, almost reverently, as if unsure it wouldn't vanish when she blinked. Emma lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, heart full and heavy all at once. The rain had picked up again outside, tapping softly against the windows. The apartment was quiet, not lonely, but peaceful. Just before sleep took her, Emma heard the door creak open. Eleanor's voice came softly through the dark. "Emma?" "Yeah. I've never been saved by a waitress before." Emma smiled, eyes burning in the quiet. "Get some sleep," she whispered. And in the dark, with the hum of the city beyond the windows, neither of them felt forgotten. The first week with Eleanor in the apartment passed gently, like a soft breeze through an open window. She didn't take up much space, moved quietly, folded blankets with precision, and always made the tea before Emma returned from her shift. They developed a rhythm that needed no instructions. Emma would come home to the sound of a kettle boiling and the faint scent of lemon cleaner. There was something comforting in knowing someone was there, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. Eleanor insisted on helping. She washed dishes with care, always placing the mugs upside down in perfect rows. She folded Emma's laundry even when Emma told her not to, saying, "It keeps my hands from getting bored." On Sunday, they visited the corner market, and Eleanor picked out oranges like a woman who once had a garden of her own. When Emma offered to pay, Eleanor slipped a quarter into her palm and whispered, "Let me feel useful." They didn't talk much about the future. Neither of them asked what came next. But in those quiet hours reading together, sipping tea by the window, laughing softly at nothing, it felt like something was being rebuilt. A life. A kind of peace that neither woman had dared imagine they'd find again. On the 7th night, Emma came home late. The diner had been short-staffed, and her feet ached from doubling shifts. She opened the apartment door with a tired smile, expecting the usual warmth, the lamplight, the smell of chamomile. But instead, she was met with silence. Stillness. The kind that tells you something is wrong before you even know why. The kitchen was spotless. Every dish dried and stacked. The couch blanket folded. A single cup, washed and placed beside the sink. Emma walked to the bedroom, already feeling her heart sink. The bed was made perfectly. Tightly tucked sheets. Pillows arranged. But it wasn't the neatness that struck her, it was the note, centered on the pillow, written in Eleanor's familiar, looping hand. Emma picked it up with trembling fingers. "Thank you for giving me something worth waking up for." Emma didn't cry right away. At first, she simply sat on the edge of the bed, the note resting in her lap, heart numb. The apartment felt colder than usual, quieter than it had any right to be. She told herself maybe Eleanor had gone for a walk. Maybe she just needed space. But deep down, Emma knew. She searched the apartment again anyway, the bathroom, the closets, even under the bed, as if she'd find answers tucked into corners. Eleanor's scarf was gone. So was her brooch. The one she hadn't worn since that first day, but had quietly kept by the windowsill. Emma barely slept that night. She sat curled on the couch, Eleanor's note on the coffee table, waiting for the sound of keys in the lock. But morning came without footsteps. The kettle never boiled. The silence had turned sharp. The next day, she asked around. The neighbors hadn't seen anything. No one remembered an older woman leaving with bags. Emma called hospitals, every ER in the district. No patient by that name, they said. No admittance record matching the description. She tried shelters next. The receptionist at one recognized the name, but shook her head. She came by weeks ago, the woman said. Polite, proud. Didn't stay. Emma pressed, begged, but there was nothing else. Just another dead end in a city full of them. By the third day, Emma's hands shook every time the doorbell buzzed. She imagined all the worst possibilities. Maybe Eleanor had fallen. Maybe she was wandering, confused. Maybe she'd been taken. But some part of her, the part that knew Eleanor's quiet resolve, knew it was none of those things. Her coworkers started to notice. You okay? Gina asked one morning, watching Emma refill a sugar dispenser for the third time. I'm fine, Emma said. It was a lie she told well. But even Ray, the usually sarcastic cook, muttered, haven't seen that lady in a while. The one with the silver pin. That was when the whispers started. Gina again, softer this time. Emma, are you sure she wasn't just playing you? Another server chimed in. You took her in, right? People like that, they know how to make it look real. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't, not without screaming. But the worst part wasn't what they said. It was that tiny, gnawing seed of doubt they planted. Emma remembered Eleanor's trembling hands, her distant eyes, her stories told in pieces. Had any of it been real? Was she just someone passing through, looking for warmth until it was time to move on? Emma didn't believe it. Couldn't. Wouldn't. Because deep down, she had seen something in Eleanor no one else had, not just sadness, but sorrow. Not manipulation, but memory. That Friday, after her shift, Emma sat alone in Eleanor's old booth. She didn't order anything. Just sat there, hands curled around nothing, staring out the window where Eleanor used to glance when she spoke of oceans and gardens. The sunlight filtered in through the blinds, slashing light and shadow across the table. It was supposed to be just another day, but it wasn't. Because someone was missing. The scarf was still in the apartment. Emma found it days later, tucked into the back of the linen drawer, folded with care. It smelled faintly of lavender. She pressed it to her chest, closed her eyes, and breathed. Not because it gave her answers, but because it reminded her that kindness had passed through her life, even if only for a moment. Have you ever lost someone who changed you, not through their presence, but through their sudden absence? If this story resonates with you, share your story in the comments and subscribe. It had been almost 3 weeks since Eleanor vanished, and every day still began the same. Emma brewed tea, filled the sugar containers, and glanced at the door without meaning to. The 7:04 a.m. ritual had been broken, but her body hadn't caught up to the loss. The booth by the window remained empty, its cushions slightly sunken, untouched by anyone else. Sometimes, Emma would wipe it twice, just to feel like she was doing something. Her coworkers had stopped asking about Eleanor, but the silence around her name felt heavier than words. Customers came and went, leaving behind the usual clatter of plates and shallow conversation. But for Emma, time had stretched into something long and slow, like waiting for someone who never promised to return. She'd stopped checking the shelters, stopped calling hospitals. But a piece of her, stubborn and aching, still believed the story wasn't over. It was a Tuesday morning when it happened. The cafe had just opened, the air still warm from the first pots of coffee brewing. Rain tapped against the windows like a soft metronome, steady and indifferent. Emma was sweeping behind the counter when she heard the deep, mechanical hum of engines outside. Then tires crunching against gravel, brakes hissing, doors slamming. Everyone turned. A black SUV pulled up beside the curb, followed by another and another. The kind of convoy you only saw in political dramas or high-level security operations. Gina dropped her pen. Ray peeked out from the kitchen window, eyebrows raised. Emma's spine stiffened before she even understood why. 4 men stepped out first, all in dark suits, earpieces gleaming beneath close-cropped hair. Behind them, 2 women emerged, both in crisp navy uniforms. The taller of the 2 moved with a kind of poise that made the entire room feel smaller. Her posture was regal, commanding, like someone used to standing in rooms that listened before speaking. And then, with a glance around the cafe, she nodded once. One of the suited men stepped forward, voice low but unmistakably firm. "Is there an Emma Clark here?" he asked. The cafe fell silent. Emma froze behind the register, heart lurching into her throat. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "That's me." The man turned and gestured. The taller woman, the one in the darker navy uniform, stepped forward, her face unreadable but not unkind. Her shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, each step purposeful. She stopped in front of Emma and saluted. "My name is Admiral Jessica Jones," she said clearly. "I believe you knew my mother." Emma's knees nearly buckled. She blinked, trying to make sense of the words, "Admiral? Mother?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Admiral Jones, still composed, lowered her hand. "Eleanor Hayes," she said softly. "She spoke of you often." Emma felt the world tilt. Her grip tightened around the edge of the counter as if the room itself might slide away. She could feel everyone staring, coworkers, customers, even the dishwasher had come out from the back. But nothing registered except the name. "Eleanor, was your mother?" she finally asked, barely managing the words. Jessica nodded. "She passed away last night," she said, her voice level but not emotionless. Peacefully. In her sleep. Emma's mouth fell open, eyes wide. The grief she thought she had processed came rushing back like a wave she'd tried to outpace. But confusion rose just as quickly. Why are you here?" she asked, still dazed. One of the lawyers, a man with silver hair and a leather folio, stepped forward and opened it with practiced ease. "Miss Clark," he began gently, "we're here because Mrs. Hayes left behind specific instructions regarding you." Emma stared, not understanding. "Instructions?" Jessica nodded once more. "She left everything in place for this moment. Should she pass, we were to find you immediately." Emma's breath caught. "Me?" The lawyer stepped aside to reveal a sealed envelope. Jessica handed it over. "She wanted you to have this first." Emma took the envelope with trembling hands. It was cream-colored, thick, and heavy, the kind used for wedding invitations or letters that matter. On the front, in elegant cursive, "To Emma, the daughter my heart chose." The room disappeared for a moment. All the sounds, the coffee brewing, the clinking of forks, faded into a quiet hush only she could hear. She opened the letter with careful fingers. Inside was Eleanor's handwriting, neat, deliberate, unwavering. "My dearest Emma, you reminded me that people are still capable of kindness without reward, loyalty without expectation, and love without permission. I had everything once. Then I had nothing. Then I met you. Thank you for giving me something to believe in again." Tears blurred Emma's vision. She pressed the letter to her chest, unsure what to feel first, the ache, the shock, the swelling wave of something that felt too big to name. "I didn't know," she whispered. "She never told me who she really was." Jessica stepped forward again, her voice quieter now. "That's because she didn't want you to treat her differently. She needed to know someone would care without knowing the name." Jessica looked around the cafe, the humble space where her mother had found peace again. "And she found it in you." Emma couldn't speak. She simply nodded, heart pounding against the weight of Eleanor's final gift. The lawyer cleared his throat gently. "There are more matters to discuss, Miss Clark, but only when you're ready." Emma swallowed hard. I don't know if I am." Jessica placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Take your time. We're not here to take, we're here because she gave." The convoy didn't linger. After a few more quiet words and exchanges, the Admiral and her team exited with the same grace they entered. Emma stood frozen behind the counter, the letter still pressed to her chest. No one spoke for a long time. And then Gina stepped forward, voice small. "Emma, who is she?" Emma looked toward the window booth. The seat was still empty. Still waiting. But now it meant something different. "She was someone who mattered," Emma said, tears slipping freely now. Even when the world forgot, she never stopped being someone worth showing up for. The morning after the convoy left, Ridgeview Café felt like it was holding its breath. Emma arrived early, Eleanor's letter still folded carefully in her coat pocket, worn soft from reading it again and again. The booth by the window remained empty, but somehow it felt fuller than before. Not because someone sat there, but because of everything it now held: memory, mystery, and something sacred. Ray offered her a silent nod. Gina brought her tea without asking. Later that day, the black SUV returned, quieter this time, almost respectfully so. Emma stepped inside without fanfare, sitting in the back seat while the city passed by in streaks of winter gray. No one spoke until they pulled through a wide iron gate and into a private estate nestled behind tall hedges and older trees. The home was beautiful, stately but modest, not grand like a palace, but dignified like a memory kept alive. Jessica Jones waited on the front steps, out of uniform this time, dressed in dark wool, her expression softer now. They sat in the library, surrounded by books and old portraits that looked like they had stories of their own. Jessica poured the tea herself, strong, black, no sugar, and passed Emma a cup. "I thought it was time you knew everything," she said quietly. "Not just about my mother, but about who she chose to become after everything else was taken." Emma nodded, the letter still in her pocket, her hands wrapped around the cup for courage. "Eleanor Hayes was born into a military family," Jessica began, voice even. "She met my father, Rear Admiral Thomas Hayes, when she was 19. They married young, he deployed, she followed when she could. They had 2 daughters. I was the first. My younger sister, Claire, followed him into service." Emma listened closely, imagining Eleanor as a young woman, proud, strong, standing beside a man in dress whites. Jessica's voice didn't break, but the weight behind her words said enough. "My father was killed in a helicopter training accident 12 years ago. Claire was still in active duty when it happened. She died 2 years later, combat operation overseas." Jessica paused, looking down at her tea. "That was when something in my mother shattered. She disappeared from public life shortly after," Jessica continued. "She resigned from every charity board, withdrew from Hayes Naval Foundation, and refused any inheritance tied to her husband's rank." Emma frowned slightly. "Why?" Jessica looked up. "Because none of it felt real to her anymore. She told me once, it's easy to be loved when you're Eleanor Hayes, the Admiral's wife. I need to know if anyone would still care if I was just Eleanor." Emma blinked back sudden tears. "She came to the cafe with nothing," she whispered. Jessica nodded. "She wanted it that way. No name, no estate, no shield." There was a pause before she added, "She told me once, if I find one person who is kind to me without knowing who I am, I'll believe the world still has good people in it." The room went quiet, heavy with all the things Eleanor had never said aloud. Jessica stood and walked to the desk in the corner. She pulled out a small leather folder and set it gently in front of Emma. Inside were handwritten letters, delicate and neatly dated, each one addressed to "My Emma." "She wrote these during the weeks she lived with you," Jessica said. "I think she wanted you to know how much those days meant." Emma opened the first letter and read silently. "Emma, you don't know me, not really. But every time you poured me tea or offered warm toast, you gave me a reason to stay one more day. I didn't need a savior. I needed a human being who saw me, not my rank, not my last name, not the shadow I became. And somehow, that person turned out to be you." Her fingers trembled, but she kept reading. "I came to your cafe expecting to be invisible. But you refused to let me be. You asked nothing of me. And in that, you gave me everything. The world taught me power. You reminded me of peace. Thank you." By the third letter, Emma had to set the folder down and wipe her eyes. She looked up at Jessica, who was already watching her with a quiet kind of understanding. "Why didn't she tell me?" Emma asked. "Why keep it all hidden?" Jessica leaned back slightly. Because she didn't want your kindness to change. She wanted it to be real, unfiltered. A moment passed, thick with emotion. Then the lawyer, the same one from the cafe, entered the room with a different folder, thicker, weightier. "Miss Clark," he said, "with Admiral Hayes passing, we are now executing the updated version of her will." Emma sat up straighter, suddenly overwhelmed. "She left me something?" Jessica gave a faint smile. "She left you more than that." The lawyer opened the folder and began to explain. Eleanor had revised her will just 10 days before her passing. In it, she named Emma Clark as the beneficiary of her personal estate, including family heirlooms, a small cottage near the sea, and a trust account she had privately maintained. She said it wasn't a reward, the lawyer added. It was a reflection of a life changed by love, the kind no bloodline could claim. Jessica said nothing, only nodded as if she'd read the will herself 100 times and still hadn't memorized its meaning. Emma shook her head slowly, voice trembling. "I never asked for this." Jessica stepped closer. "And she never gave it to someone who asked. She gave it to someone who gave first, without condition." Then, softer, "My mother didn't need a nurse, Emma. She needed someone who reminded her of who she was." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water, spreading quiet shock, sadness, and something like honor. Emma didn't speak. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, clutching one of Eleanor's letters in both hands. Outside, the garden was in bloom, even in winter, and for a brief moment, she imagined Eleanor sitting there, scarf around her neck, smiling at a world that had finally proven her hope right. The cottage stood on a quiet slope overlooking the sea, its windows braced against the salt wind and its garden half sleeping in the cold. Emma stepped out of the black SUV and inhaled deeply, tasting the air Eleanor had once described as salt and freedom. The house wasn't large, but it radiated something steady: old stone walls, blue shutters, and a wraparound porch with wicker chairs facing the cliffs. It looked exactly like something Eleanor would choose, dignified but unpretentious. Jessica stood beside her in silence, then gently handed Emma a brass key. "Take your time," she said. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old books. The living room was warm, sunlight cutting through gauzy curtains and catching on glass picture frames. A fire hadn't been lit in weeks, but everything was still and clean, as if the house had been waiting. Emma walked slowly, her fingertips brushing the back of an armchair, the spines of books on the shelves. She felt like she had stepped into a memory someone had preserved just for her. There were photographs on the mantel, one of Eleanor laughing with a man in uniform, another of 2 young girls holding hands at the edge of a dock. Emma stared at the younger version of Jessica, her face sharper but still serious, and beside her a girl with wild hair and a sunlit smile. Claire, she thought. The sister Eleanor had mentioned only once. They were her whole world, Jessica had said. And when they were gone, she needed to find a new reason to stay. The garden was quiet, but alive, hardy winter plants rustling gently, wind chimes singing from under the eaves. Emma stepped onto the flagstone path, her shoes crunching softly on frost-bitten leaves. She followed it to the back of the cottage, where a wooden bench overlooked the sea. There, just beside it, a small book lay under glass in a protective case, weathered but safe. Emma lifted the lid, heart fluttering as she recognized the title, The Light Between Oceans. It was the first book Eleanor had gifted her. The pages were marked with notes, underlined lines, and slips of paper tucked like secret thoughts. Emma flipped through them slowly, each margin a message, words like, "For the ones who stay even when no one asks," and "Some people anchor us without ever knowing." She felt tears sting her eyes. This wasn't just a garden. It was a living memory of all the parts Eleanor hadn't said aloud. Back inside, Emma found the study filled with more books, all grouped by themes: military history, poetry, novels about the sea. Several had bookmarks that matched the ones Eleanor used at the cafe. On the desk was a sealed box made of polished cherry wood with brass hinges and her initials engraved into the lid. Emma opened it slowly, unsure what she'd find. Inside, nestled in navy velvet, was the silver brooch, The one Eleanor had worn every morning until the day she hadn't. Beside it was a handwritten note on thick paper, folded twice and labeled simply, Emma. She opened it, already bracing for the emotion that came with Eleanor's words. Wear this when you feel lost. It always pointed me home. It's not the medal that matters. It's the memory inside it, and now that memory is yours. Emma held the brooch in her hand, tracing its lines with the tip of her thumb. It was heavier than she remembered, but it fit in her palm like it belonged there. She could almost hear Eleanor's voice, steady, gentle, amused. You always bring the tea hot, she had once said. Like you believe it still matters. And now that quiet belief had become something far more lasting. The afternoon light dimmed as she explored the rest of the house. There were more letters, more notes, one tucked into a drawer, another slipped between the pages of a gardening manual. Each one was addressed to her, as if Eleanor had prepared a path made of breadcrumbs for Emma to follow long after she was gone. One said, if you're reading this, I'm proud of you. You stayed when I was someone no one else saw. Another simply read, I hope the sea gives you the peace it once gave me. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, a blue quilt stretched tight across the mattress. Emma sat on the edge and looked out the window, watching the waves roll against the rocks. She pinned the brooch to her coat without even thinking, not for style, but for meaning. The silver crest gleamed softly in the fading light, and with it came a strange calm. Like she had stepped fully into a story that had been waiting for her. She stood once more and returned to the cliffs. The wind was colder now, but she didn't flinch. She held the brooch tightly in one hand and let the other stretch toward the horizon. The ocean roared below, endless and alive, and for a moment she felt Eleanor beside her in the air, in the silence, in the steadiness of her own breath. I'll make it count, she whispered, and the wind carried it like a promise. Have you ever inherited something, an object, a place, a memory, that made you feel closer to someone long after they were gone? If this moment touched you, let us know in the comments and subscribe. The days after the visit to the cottage passed in quiet waves. Emma returned to the cafe, but everything felt different now, not in a bad way, just changed. She still poured tea and wiped tables, still greeted regulars with a smile. But she carried something inside her that no one else could see, the weight of memory and the gift of having been seen. The brooch stayed pinned to her coat, close to her heart. Jessica returned to the cafe a few days later, this time without the convoy or the crisp salute. She wore jeans, a wool sweater, and a face that looked a little more like a daughter than a commanding officer. They sat in Eleanor's booth, 2 cups of tea between them, and for a long time neither spoke. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows. Finally, Jessica looked up and said, I should have been there for her. Emma didn't flinch. She never blamed you, she said quietly. Not once. Jessica nodded, jaw tightening just slightly. I know. That almost makes it harder. Emma reached across the table, resting her fingers gently against the rim of Jessica's cup. She just missed you. That's all. Jessica took a breath, deep and long, as if trying to steady something that had been shaking inside her for years. She used to say I was all mission, no soul, she said with a faint laugh. And she wasn't wrong. I spent so long trying to prove myself in a system built to forget women like her. Emma listened, understanding more than she expected. I think she knew you were doing your best, she offered. But sometimes the best we give the world is the part we don't know how to give the people we love. The conversation shifted then, not away from grief, but toward something lighter. Jessica pulled out a small, folded invitation from her coat pocket. There's going to be a memorial this weekend, she said. Small. Mostly naval families, some Foundation people, and I'd like you to be there. Emma hesitated, eyes flickering to the brooch. I don't know if I belong in that world, she whispered. Jessica tilted her head. You belonged in her world, she said. That's more than enough. Emma bit her lip, the emotion already rising. Okay, she said softly. But only if I don't have to speak. Jessica smiled. I think you already said everything that mattered by being who you were. On the morning of the memorial, Emma stood in front of her mirror, smoothing out the navy blue dress she hadn't worn in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned the brooch to her chest, its silver surface catching the light. It gleamed like a badge, but not one earned by rank, one earned by love. She tied her hair back, slipped on simple shoes, and stared at her reflection. "You've got this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to. The hall was small, but elegant, lined with naval flags and soft white lilies. Men and women in uniform filled the seats, their shoulders straight, their expressions quiet. A photo of Eleanor sat at the front, framed in silver, beside a folded flag and a single candle. Emma stepped in slowly, unsure of where to go, but Jessica appeared at her side and guided her to a seat in the front row. "You're not a guest," she whispered. "You're part of this." The service opened with a moment of silence and the soft swell of a string quartet. A chaplain spoke first, kind words, official, reverent. Then came a few speeches from old colleagues, each remembering Eleanor as graceful, dignified, a lighthouse in stormy seas. Emma listened, holding her hands in her lap, heart beating quietly beneath the brooch. And then Jessica stood. She walked to the podium, shoulders squared, but eyes softer than Emma had ever seen them. "She was my mother," she began, her voice calm. "And she was more than titles and photographs. She was the woman who raised 2 daughters to think critically, love deeply, and challenge everything we were told to accept." The crowd leaned in, listening. But when loss took too much from her, she stepped away and became someone new. "She went searching," Jessica continued. "For truth. For goodness. And she found it, not in medals or uniforms, but in a diner on a quiet street, in a waitress who offered hot tea and kindness without condition." Emma's breath caught. Jessica's voice didn't waver. "Emma Clark was my mother's final act of faith and humanity. She deserves to be remembered as family." The room fell still. A beat passed. Then another. And slowly, gently, the audience began to clap, not loud, not showy, but respectful. Emma's hands trembled in her lap. She didn't look up at first, afraid her face would give too much away. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, catching at the corners of her mouth. She brushed them away with shaking fingers, blinking hard as the room rose around her. One by one, people in uniform stood, not to salute, but to honor. She wasn't sure what to do, so she stayed seated, letting the wave pass over her. Jessica returned to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She chose you," she whispered. Just like that. Emma nodded, unable to speak. But in her chest, something finally settled. Not closure, not yet. But peace, the kind that doesn't come from answers, only understanding. The kind Eleanor had once longed for, and somehow left behind. The bell above Ridgeview Café jingled one final time as Emma stepped inside, the morning light cutting across the worn tile floor. Everything looked the same and yet different, the walls freshly painted, the booths stripped down, the old menu boards taken down for good. The renovation crew would arrive in a few hours, but for now, the café belonged to memory. Emma moved slowly between tables, running her fingers along the counters, breathing in that familiar scent of coffee, toast, and thyme. The quiet settled like dust, soft and familiar. She reached the booth by the window, Eleanor's booth, and paused. There, gleaming beneath the sunlight, was the new brass plaque mounted to the wood. It read, "In memory of Eleanor Hayes, beloved mother, kind soul." Emma crouched beside it, her hand tracing each word like they were sacred. No crowd watched, no applause rang out, just silence and the sound of her own heart. Somehow, that felt right. A lot had changed in the weeks since the memorial. Emma had stepped away from the cafe, not because she stopped caring, but because something inside her had shifted. She had enrolled in a nonprofit leadership program with a full scholarship funded by the Hayes Family Trust. Her new focus, launching a network of shelters for elderly women, safe spaces for those, like Eleanor, who once lived invisible lives. She worked late nights now, studied hard, and carried Eleanor's story into every meeting. Kindness is infrastructure too, she'd once told the board. Jessica checked in often, never imposing, always sincere. Sometimes they'd meet for tea, other times for long walks along the cliffs near the cottage. The silences between them were never awkward, only full of the people they missed and the things they were still learning to say. One afternoon, Jessica arrived holding a carefully folded flag in both hands. "This was my mother's," she said, eyes shining. "She wanted you to have it." Emma took it with reverence, fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the cloth. The weight of it felt different. Not just military, but maternal. It wasn't about country or duty anymore. It was about memory. About love passed down in unexpected ways. They didn't say much after that. The sea stretched endlessly behind them, and the wind tugged gently at their coats. Jessica placed a hand on Emma's shoulder before leaving. "You're carrying her legacy better than any of us ever could," she whispered. Emma nodded, not because she agreed, but because she wanted to keep trying. On the final morning before the cafe's renovation began, Emma came in early, long before the workers, long before the noise. She made herself a cup of tea, buttered 2 slices of toast, and sat at Eleanor's booth alone. The seats still creaked the same way, the light still filtered through the blinds just right. She placed the flag on the table, next to her cup, and looked out the window toward the rising sun. The city was still waking up, but Emma felt fully awake. She thought of all the mornings Eleanor had sat there. Of her quiet smile, her trembling hands, the way she folded napkins so precisely. She remembered the scarf, the library card, the night spent in Emma's apartment wrapped in stillness and warmth. She remembered Eleanor's voice in the dark, "I've never been saved by a waitress before." And she remembered what Jessica had said at the memorial, "She chose you." A waitress, yes, but also a witness. To pain. To grace. To the truth that some lives bloom again because someone cared enough to water them. Emma took a sip of her tea and let the memory settle in her chest like a second heartbeat. She hadn't rescued Eleanor. They'd rescued each other. Outside, the street was coming alive, slow traffic, faint music from a car radio, the bark of a dog a block away. Emma didn't rush. She let the moment hold her like a hand on her back, steadying, reminding. Soon, new paint would cover the walls, new chairs would replace the old. But the plaque would remain. The booth would still be there. She finished the last sip of her tea and stood slowly, folding the flag and tucking it beneath her arm. Before leaving, she glanced back one last time at the window, the plaque, the sunlight spilling across Eleanor's seat. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to the room, but to the woman who had taught her that kindness wasn't something you gave to be seen, it was something you gave to remember who you are. Then she stepped outside, letting the door swing closed behind her with one final soft chime. The wind tugged at her coat as she walked toward the future she was building, one act of compassion at a time. The brooch still pinned to her chest glinted in the morning light. She didn't touch it. She didn't have to. In a world of uniforms and medals, all it took was warm tea and a quiet booth to remind someone they still mattered. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.